Welcome to the Game Scholar Podcast. I'm your co-host, Rob Farr, and I'm here with Leonard, the Game Scholar Herman, the father of
I'm
the game
your
scholar.
co-host, Leonard Herman.
And really, you're the reason why people listen. No one cares about my voice.
And all three of them.
So this is episode 4 of the Game Scholar Podcast. This is the second episode in our mini-series examining the Netflix documentary series High Score. We are looking at the series from a game historian perspective and, talking about if they got a fact wrong. Everybody gets things wrong here and there, things like that. But if they did, we want to point it out. If there's something weird, we want to point it out. So this is our second episode. The first episode was it dealt with a lot of earlier stuff, and the second episode jumps and is more towards the NES era. Would you think? Do you think that is fairly reasonable?
Yeah, I mean, most of this episode is about the NES or the Famicom.
So they start out with some footage, or at least maybe they didn't start out with, but the first thing I noticed early on in the episode, they had some nice footage of Tokyo. They flashed Shibuya and Shinjuku and stuff like that. I'm a Japan nerd, so that was pretty cool. It must have been fun for that documentary film crew to fly out there and have fun because it's an awesome place. They're talking one of the marketing people, a lady, her name escapes me at the time. It was interesting. She was talking about the Famicom and how it was transitioned to the States to become the NES. And she claimed that the Famicom rebrand was for consumers, which I thought was interesting because I was always under the impression, and I did some reading up on this in preparation for this episode, and that I was always under the impression that the NES rebrand, was partially, to Westernize it and to make it more Western friendly. But the biggest the main thrust for changing it and making it the way that they did, and again, I think this was, if I'm right on this, I think it was a missed opportunity. The reason why they changed the NES so drastically was to get away, was for retailers. It was for confident. It was for retailers and for people whose confidence had been shaken by video games in general, because of the video game crash of '83 in America. Video games they were viewed as a fad. So her stating that it was really driven by, something for consumers, I felt was really odd, or maybe not odd, but at least incomplete. Because as we were discussing before we started recording, that they didn't mention Rob the Robot or anything else. They didn't get into why it was called the Nintendo Entertainment System instead of Nintendo Video Game System or something like that.
Oh, nothing that wasn't mentioned, but it's not really necessary for the documentary. It's how they offered Atari the worldwide rights to it.
Yeah, that would have been a nice bridge. But again, this isn't a and we should probably start, for anybody who hasn't listened to High Score. Obviously, it's a documentary on video games. It's sort of like a pop documentary. People had approached it as this historic thing. Not really a history thing. So that's probably why they missed those opportunities, at least in part, because they don't have to make those connections. But it felt very incomplete, interesting, but incomplete, and probably misleading, because there's probably people who are going around there now saying, or people who watch this going, hey, I learned so much, and it was totally rebranded just for consumers. And so I had a problem with that. I felt that section was misleading. Interesting, but misleading. You're starting to see a trend emerge in episode 2 where they're talking about competitive gaming still. And they start focusing on the Nintendo. I think it was called Power Fest back then, but it's known as the Nintendo World Championships now. It's kind of
Okay.
how, or maybe it was called. I don't. The naming escapes me, but I think that's how it went. And they focused on one of the players who was competing, and he must have. I think he won because he has a trophy. Yeah, I'm fairly certain he won. And they also had a shot of him inserting a gray Nintendo World Championship cartridge into an NES, and that was given away to the winners of the tournaments.
No, I'm not sure.
I think that's how it went. They gave away gray cartridges to either some of the participants or the winners, and that's why there's a bunch of gray cartridges that are out there. But there are only a couple Nintendo World Championship gold cartridges, and they were given out by some giveaway from Nintendo Power, and we'll talk about Nintendo Power coming up too. I'm fairly certain, and that's how they were unearthed, and that's why they're worth oodles of cash now to some people. And then they went into the Nintendo Game Counselor stuff. What did you think of that?
I thought the whole part was a waste of time.
You didn't like the skits with Sean Bloom wearing a fucking mullet?
Not really, not particularly.
Yeah,
and to tell how cool they were in the mall because they were wearing their jackets.
Yeah, they were mobbed. I wonder if any pedophiles that, wow, children are mobbing those guys. Where do they work? But I actually think the game counselor stuff is pretty interesting. And there's some guy who's very into the game counselor stuff. I guess he's some sort of collector. And if you search for it, I guess on YouTube, you put like game counselor and what's the Portland show? Portland Retro Gaming.
Yeah.
They did a panel with some of the game counselors. I wouldn't be shocked if Sean Bloom was there. And it was much more informative than what High Score had shown. Yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting, but a throwaway. But again, viewed through the lens of this being a pop documentary, I guess it worked, but it did nothing for me personally. And that's the same with the competitive gaming stuff and the World Championship. And I guess if there is a greater thread that runs through the other episodes with competitive gaming, I guess it makes sense. If not, I'm not quite sure why they're focusing on it so heavy, not just in this episode, but the previous. Then they went on to touch on within the Donkey Kong lawsuit section how Kirby, the Nintendo character, got his name. I think the episode was dedicated to Kirby.
It was dedicated. Well, he died last year.
Yeah, 2019. So that was interesting. Again, I think those little factoids are sort of why people are misled into thinking that this is based heavily on video game or this is more of a historic documentary. Again, when it's not, but it does again brushes up against some of that stuff. And then they talk about the creation of Nintendo Power. What did you think about that?
Again, I wasn't so thrilled about that either. I mean, what was Nintendo Power? It was a promotional tool for Nintendo. And, well, Nintendo Japan had a magazine, so we made one too. I mean, I was never a fan of Nintendo Power magazine. I didn't subscribe. I never even liked Nintendo back in the day. So,
but you love them now.
Yeah.
I wish they had maybe even had. Now, again, I understand this is pop, but it some of the stuff that they go over is lacking so much context. Like if you're a viewer and you don't know anything about this, I mean, what's your takeaway on the Nintendo Power piece? I mean, some people are probably watching this going, what is a magazine? So even explaining what a magazine is, I guess they still sell them. So I guess maybe not. But you know, at least contextualizing like what was Nintendo Power the first game magazine? Like, there's no context. There's nothing. They offered
I
no
mean, to make it
insight.
sound like it's the only magazine.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
They really like we're going in understanding what the landscape is like and what the story is. But they don't really go into it. They don't really say anything. They don't talk about the even impact of Nintendo Power. They don't talk about any ethical stuff. They don't, Nintendo. Like, what did Nintendo Power have to offer? They did talk about like strategy sections and things like that, but they offered reviews in Nintendo Power. They offered news in Nintendo Power, and there was nothing about like, on one hand, like in the first episode, they'll take a shit on Jerry Lawson's colleagues, but they won't talk about anything about, like, is it ethical to have a magazine that's basically propaganda reviewing the games for the company that owns the magazine and things like that, and how helpful. Like, there's nothing about that. Like, it's weird. Like, on one hand, they'll talk about some heavy issue, but then on the other, they're like totally like hands off with stuff. And I think that would have been an interesting.
Well, that's what I was saying. Well, same thing also about Nintendo being a total monopoly back in the day.
Yeah,
They don't go into that.
And the implications. And first of all, well, why were they a monopoly? And that's related to the first episode.
Yeah.
And then it's, what were the implications of them being a monopoly? Like, I think if they weren't a monopoly, I still think they would have routed Sega, but they wouldn't have created animosity among third parties. Or when they finally did get a viable platform with Sega, they jumped ship. Maybe not jump ship, but they at least were eager to do business with Sega, like EA. So, I don't know. Again, it's not a historic documentary, but there's so many different parts and pieces that they could have connected or addressed, and I don't think it would have added so much to the runtime, and at least would have been helpful, because how they didn't know that people would have approached that thinking that it was a historic documentary, because they do talk about they want to unearth certain things and everything else. But if that's their goal is to be is to have that historic and educational element, I think they fail every time. They have bits.
Oh, so far anyway.
Well, maybe not every time, but enough of the time. There's some parts that are good, and there's some parts that are just total crap that just mislead, that are incomplete. There's all these missed opportunities as we just mentioned, where you could connect certain things. It just wasn't there. And it does smell, not that you have to be in love with video games to cover video games in any way, but it really does smell like the filmmakers just really weren't into it. That they were just kind of like, oh, this is something neat that we can do. I know that they've done other video game stuff, like 8-Bit Legacy or something I've never seen.
I don't know.
And again, it just seemed like people who were like kind of into games, but like just didn't get it or something. I don't know. So while I think so the Nintendo Power part was the last piece of it, and then it jumped. Here's another thing, by the way. I'm sorry, I missed this. During the Donkey Kong lawsuit, they say something to the effect that the Donkey Kong lawsuit, the win for Nintendo, paved the way for the Nintendo World Championships, like 8 years later, somehow, which I thought was a very weird and jerky connection. I mean,
yeah.
it's like saying, like, the success of Pong laid the way to The Last of Us 2 for PlayStation 4 or something. And I guess, yeah, broadly, but what is that? How helpful is that? How insightful is that? I guess in a very broad way, sure. But I like, they just made these very weird statements, and it seemed like the mandate, and it's not necessarily a bad mandate for a casual viewer, was more to be snappy and poppy, you have this sort of like pop documentary aesthetic, to be entertaining, bombastic, and not to be necessarily correct. Like it's okay to mislead. It's okay to set certain things up like that. The filmmakers, it seems, are quite okay with being very liberal in the sense of taking, or taking liberties with things.
Well, the thing is, who's going to challenge them? You can say we are, but really, I mean, people watching Netflix aren't. Most of the people who saw that show are not listening to us right now, or reading any
You
reviews.
Don't think so?
Maybe a few of them, but really, nobody's challenging them. Most of the viewers of Netflix think this is great.
That's fine. That's fine. But for the people who know the truth about these things, or maybe, again, like I said, there's all sorts of connections that they could have made. They don't have to do them all. They don't have to make all the connections, but just there are certain things that like directly related to like the second or the first episode, and it's just like, why didn't you even say something? Like you said, like the deal with Atari. Just a quick sentence. Or something. Just and again, just to relate. Like I'm not even saying like you were saying. I think the first episode, like, oh, they don't say anything with Ralph Baer. Like this related to the last episode. Like why wouldn't you want to make that connection? Unless maybe they have insight into the audience where they just don't care or they're not paying attention. I mean, hell, didn't you rewatch the first episode because it was so forgettable?
I mean, it was the deal that Atari didn't take that more directly led to the contest.
What are you talking about?
No, you said that the winning the lawsuit against Universal led to the competition, but I'm saying,
you're saying for the distribution.
Atari not taking the deal led more to the competition than winning the lawsuit against Universal.
Yeah, I mean, there's but again, it's just it was a very weird or bad observation, or maybe both. So yeah, I didn't think this. That's all I kind of had to say.
Well, I thought I thought the first one was better than the second one.
Yeah, I kind of. It does feel like they blew their load a little early, doesn't it?
Well,
it seems like they front loaded some of the more interesting stuff, and also it's, you know what, too, it's, you're starting to get the Japanese in at this point, and let's face it, it's really boring for some of these players, the Japanese guys to be on screen talking too. Like Howard Scott Warshaw, an American guy, he can flail his arms and he can be bombastic and things like that and entertaining. And then you have these reserved.
Well, this old guy who wrote music for Nintendo. Then you got to read the subtitles.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
He was pretty boring. I'm sorry.
Well, that's what I'm saying though. Like that is just a weakness of the telling a story with the Japanese, who made the most exciting video games as far as I'm concerned. But they're boring for a Western. They bore me, and I love this stuff. So I can understand why the first episode felt like it was more dynamic than the second, even though the second had, at least, in terms of the stuff that I'm into, it was more it was more inclusive of that. So if we truly, I guess my thoughts on not just this episode but the first episode as well, while there are positive and negatives, if we weren't doing this and I wasn't reviewing this for my other channel, based on a video game on Facebook, by the way, if anyone wants to check it out, that's all on video game adaptations and movies and television and everything else. What I'm getting at is it's really tedious, and I've said it before, but I would have turned this off and stopped watching.
Well, I lost the second one. I definitely lost interest towards the end.
Yes.
I got
And,
distracted with something else. I really didn't pay much attention to it.
and then they lead it off and they go, well, we talked about Nintendo, but how about role-playing games? The third episode is about role-playing stuff. And it's just another weird, incredibly jerky transition into something else. And
I look forward to seeing that.
No, it's the worst one. I think it'll be a better episode for us, but in terms
What, the critique?
Yes, to critique, but I mean there are some things in it that are ridiculous. So anyway, I think that's all for episode 2, unless you've got anything else to add, Mr. Game Scholar.
No, like I said, I got distracted towards the end, so it did not keep my attention.
Yeah, again, I can understand why a layman would be cool with this. Somebody who really isn't into video games and really isn't into cinema, and just wants to watch some crazy pop documentary. I say crazy, like in terms of some of the shots. Oh, by the way, another positive thing to say about this episode too. I think I said it at the top about some of the footage in Japan. They also go into a game store, and I think it's the famous. It looks very much. I've been there before. The famous Super Potato that is in Akihabara. So, God damn it! One of the other times that we were recording, the ice cream truck went by my house, and now it's doing it again. It's going to be picked up. So, anyway,
it's too bad that the studio wasn't open today for us to do it.
Yeah, too bad. So, yeah. So I thought some of the shots were pretty cool, but again, it's tough to find really great positives and whatever. I don't fault anybody for not for enjoying it or anything else, but for me, I think I'd rather listen to my mom beg for mercy than watch another episode. So,
on that note,
this is the Game Scholar Podcast, episode 4, and this is what you're listening to. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye.